The cold wind blew hard off the dark grey ocean, biting at Helen Davis's face as she stood on the edge of the rocky island. It was the early winter of 1927, and the air already held the bitter chill of a coming freeze. She pulled her thick wool shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched the small wooden motorboat push its way through the choppy water. In the back of the boat, her husband, Arthur, was steering. He raised one hand in a quick wave, and Helen raised hers back. She watched him until the boat was nothing more than a tiny dark speck rising and falling on the waves, and then she watched until the speck disappeared completely into the grey mist that hung over the mainland in the distance. Arthur was heading to the coastal town to get their winter supplies. They needed more coal for the stove, more flour and sugar for the pantry, and most importantly, more heavy oil for the great lighthouse lamp. He was supposed to be gone for only 2 days. They had listened to the weather reports on their small crackling radio the night before, and the man on the broadcast had said a storm was forming far out at sea. Arthur wanted to beat the storm, get the heavy cans of oil and bags of coal, and hurry back to the island before the water got too rough. Helen agreed it was the best plan. They could not risk running out of fuel during the winter months. The ships that passed by their lonely stretch of the coast depended on the sweeping beam of light to warn them of the deadly hidden rocks that surrounded the island like sharp teeth just below the surface of the water. Now that Arthur was gone, Helen was completely alone on the tiny piece of rock. There were no trees, no other houses, and no neighbours. There was only the tall white stone tower of the lighthouse, the small attached keeper's house, and the endless rolling ocean. Helen turned away from the water and walked back toward the house. Her boots crunched on the loose gravel and sea salt that coated the ground. The wind was picking up, pushing her forward, making the heavy wooden door of the house hard to open. She pushed inside, shut the door tight against the cold, and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. The sudden quiet of the house was heavy. Usually the rooms were filled with the sounds of Arthur fixing tools, adding coal to the fire, or humming to himself as he read the daily logs. Now there was only the ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall and the muffled sound of the ocean hitting the rocks outside. Helen took off her shawl and hung it on a peg by the door. She looked around the small kitchen. Everything was clean and in its place. She had chores to do, and keeping busy was the best way to keep the loneliness away. She spent the afternoon preparing the house for the night. She carried buckets of coal from the shed out back into the kitchen and filled the small iron stove. She struck a match and got the fire going, watching the orange flames eat the black rocks until the room began to feel warm. She baked a small loaf of bread and made a simple pot of potato soup for her dinner. As the hours passed, she noticed the light coming through the small windows was changing. It was getting darker much faster than it should have. She walked to the window and looked out. The grey mist she had seen earlier was gone, replaced by thick, bruised clouds that were rolling fast across the sky. The wind was louder now, whistling through the cracks in the window frames. The sea was no longer choppy. It was angry. Deep green waves with bright white tops were slamming against the base of the island, throwing cold spray high into the air. The storm was moving in faster than the radio had said. Helen looked at the clock. It was time to go up into the tower. She wiped her hands on her apron, picked up a heavy metal can filled with kerosene oil, and walked into the hallway that connected the house to the base of the tall stone lighthouse. The air inside the tower was always cold and damp. The walls were made of thick stone blocks that seemed to hold the winter chill inside them. In the centre of the round room was a spiral staircase made of black iron. It went up and up, winding in circles until it reached the lantern room at the very top. Helen took a deep breath, grabbed the cold iron railing with her free hand, and started to climb. There were 142 steps. She knew the number by heart. She and Arthur climbed them every single day. The climb was hard work. The oil can was heavy, and it bumped against her leg as she went up. With every circle she made, the sound of the wind outside grew louder. Down at the bottom, the thick stone walls blocked most of the noise. But as she got higher, the walls grew a little thinner, and she could hear the wind screaming around the round tower. She stopped halfway up to catch her breath, resting the heavy can on a flat metal landing. She looked out a tiny, narrow window set deep into the stone. The sky was almost completely black now. There was no sunset, just a slow fading of the grey light into total darkness. She could not see the mainland at all. She could only see the wild water. She picked up the can again and kept climbing. When she reached the top, she pushed open the trap-door that led into the lantern room. This was the most important room on the island. It was made almost entirely of glass panes set into heavy brass frames. In the very centre of the room sat the great lens. It was a massive, beautiful thing, taller than Helen, made of hundreds of curved pieces of glass that sparkled even in the dim light. Inside the centre of the glass cage was the brass lamp where the fire burned. Helen set the oil can down and went to work. This was a routine she knew well. She took a soft cloth and wiped down the brass fittings. She checked the wicks to make sure they were trimmed straight and clean. If a wick was uneven, it would smoke, and the smoke would blacken the glass, making the light too dim to be seen by the ships. She poured the clear oil from her heavy can into the holding tank, watching the gauge slowly rise until it was full. Next, she had to wind the clockwork machine that made the giant lens turn. The light didn't just shine straight out, it flashed. The turning lens gathered the light and threw it out in strong, sweeping beams. To make it turn, there was a system of heavy metal weights on cables that dropped slowly down the hollow centre of the spiral stairs, just like the weights inside a tall grandfather clock. Helen grabbed the heavy iron crank handle, fitted it into the gears, and began to turn. It took all her strength to lift the weights back up to the top. The gears clicked loudly, a steady metal sound that echoed in the glass room. Her arms ached by the time she finished, but she knew the weights were set. They would keep the lens turning smoothly for the next 4 hours. After that, she would have to wind them up all over again. Finally, it was time to light the lamp. She struck a long wooden match and carefully opened the small glass door of the lamp housing. She touched the flame to the oil-soaked wicks. They caught fire instantly, burning bright and yellow. She adjusted the valve, letting more oil flow, until the flames were high and strong but not smoking. Then she closed the small glass door and stepped back. She reached over and pulled the lever that released the clockwork brakes. The heavy gears groaned for a second, and then the massive glass lens began to turn. Instantly the room was filled with blinding light. The curved glass prisms took the yellow fire and magnified it, throwing huge, solid beams of bright white light out into the dark night. Helen watched as the beams swept across the black ocean. Round and round they went, piercing through the falling rain that had just started to hit the outside glass. The rain came down hard, sounding like handfuls of small stones being thrown against the windows. The light would shine out, light up the falling rain and the white tops of the angry waves, and then sweep away, leaving darkness behind until the next beam came around. Helen stood there for a long time, watching the light do its job. She felt a deep sense of pride. Out there in the dark, sailors were fighting the terrible storm. They would be scared, cold, and lost. But then they would see her light flashing through the rain, and they would know where they were. They would know to steer away from the deadly rocks. She was keeping them safe. Helen climbed back down the long spiral stairs to the kitchen. She ate her soup and bread in silence. The wind was howling now, shaking the small house. She worried about Arthur. She hoped he had made it to the town before the worst of the storm hit. She knew he was a good sailor, but the ocean was too big and too wild to trust. She told herself he was safe in a warm inn on the mainland, drinking hot tea and waiting for the weather to clear. She decided she would not sleep in the bedroom tonight. It was too far from the tower. Instead, she dragged a thick blanket and a pillow to a wooden chair by the kitchen stove. She rested her eyes, but she did not let herself fall into a deep sleep. Every 4 hours she woke up, climbed the 142 cold stone steps, cranked the heavy iron weights back to the top, checked the oil level, and made sure the flames were burning bright. It was a long, exhausting night. When morning finally came, it didn't look like morning. The sky was a dark, angry purple, and the rain was falling in thick sheets. Helen looked out the window and gasped. The ocean was terrifying. The waves were as high as small hills, crashing violently against the island. The water rushed over the rocks, completely covering the ground where she had stood to wave goodbye to Arthur just the day before. The sea foam was thick and yellow, blown through the air by the terrible wind. She knew she could not go outside today. It was too dangerous. The wind would blow her right off the rocks and into the freezing water. She spent the second day entirely inside. She felt very small, trapped in the stone buildings, while the whole world outside seemed to be tearing itself apart. The noise was constant. The wind roared like a wild animal, and the waves hitting the base of the tower felt like small earthquakes. The floor under her feet shook with every crash. She tried to read a book, but she couldn't focus on the words. Her mind kept going to the ships out at sea and to Arthur. She checked the food supply and the coal. She had plenty to last a week if she was careful. But the oil was her main worry. The lamp burned through a lot of oil during the long winter nights. She checked the storage room at the base of the tower. There were enough full cans to last a few more days, but not much more. She prayed the storm would break soon. As the second afternoon slowly faded into the second night, Helen felt a deep weariness in her bones. Her arms still hurt from cranking the heavy weights, and her legs were tired from climbing the tall stairs. But she knew her duty. As the darkness swallowed the island again, she picked up her heavy oil can and began the long climb. Step after step, round and round. The cold air in the stairwell made her breath turn to white smoke. When she pushed open the trapdoor to the lantern room, the noise of the storm was deafening. The rain slammed against the glass so hard she feared the panes would break. The heavy brass frames rattled and shook. She went through her routine again. Wipe the brass, trim the wicks, fill the oil, crank the heavy weights, and light the fire. The great lens began to turn, sending its saving beams out into the wild night. Helen decided to stay up in the lantern room for a while. It was too loud down in the house anyway, and she wanted to keep a close eye on the lamp. The wind was so fierce it was finding tiny cracks in the window frames and blowing small draughts of cold air into the room. If a draught caught the flame wrong, it could blow it out. She found a small wooden stool, pulled it into a corner away from the draughts, wrapped her thick blanket around herself, and sat down to watch. Hours passed. The ticking of the gears, the roaring of the wind, the heavy rain, and the sweeping beams of light all blended together into a strange, dizzying rhythm. Helen's eyes felt heavy. She nodded off for a few minutes, her head resting against the cold glass behind her. She woke up with a start, her heart beating fast. She looked at the lamp. It was still burning bright. The lens was still turning. Everything was fine. She rubbed her eyes and looked out into the night. The light swept around in its great circle. When it pointed out toward the open ocean, it usually just faded away into the darkness and the rain. But as Helen watched, she noticed something strange. The beam of light did not seem to be going as far as it usually did. It looked as if it was hitting something out there in the dark. At first she thought it was just a very thick bank of fog or a heavy cloud of rain. The light hit it and scattered, making a glowing white wall in the air. But then the lens turned and the next beam swept across the same spot. Helen stood up from her stool, dropping her blanket to the floor. She walked closer to the glass and pressed her face against the cold pane, cupping her hands around her eyes to block out the glare from the lamp behind her. She waited for the light to come around again. Flash! The beam hit the darkness. It was not fog. Fog moved and swirled. Fog was soft. The thing the light was hitting had a shape. It was solid. Flash! The light swept across the sky again, pointing slightly upward. Helen held her breath. The beam of light was hitting a massive shadow in the sky. It was high up, hanging in the air over the churning ocean. Helen felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She quickly wiped the inside of the glass with her sleeve, thinking maybe there was dirt or soot tricking her eyes. She wiped it clean and stared out again, her heart hammering in her chest. Flash! The light illuminated the thing again, and this time Helen saw details that made her stomach drop. The beam was hitting the underside of something impossibly huge. It was a giant, solid mass blocking out the sky. As the bright light washed over it, she saw that it was not smooth like the metal of an airship or a blimp. It was textured. It looked like skin. It was pale and wet, glistening in the harsh white light. And it was moving. Flash! Helen took a step back, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She could not believe what she was seeing. Her brain refused to understand it. The thing in the sky was miles wide. It stretched as far as the beam of light could reach, disappearing into the darkness on either side. It was a living creature, suspended in the violent storm, hovering completely silently above the ocean. Flash! The light swept across the massive belly again. Helen saw deep, thick folds of grey, wet flesh. The skin was rippling and twitching like the muscles of a horse shaking off flies. She saw huge dark veins branching across the pale surface, pulsing with a slow, heavy rhythm. The creature was writhing, shifting its impossible weight in the sky. There were long, thick parts of it hanging down from the main body, like the roots of a giant upside-down tree or the thick tentacles of an octopus, but larger than any building she had ever seen. They dangled and slowly curled in the air, brushing against the tops of the storm clouds. Flash! Helen fell to her knees. She was shaking violently. The cold from the stone floor seeped through her dress, but she didn't feel it. She could only stare out the window. Her mind was shattering. The world she knew was simple. There was the ocean, the rocks, the island, the mainland, and the sky. There were fish in the water and birds in the air. There was no place in her world for a monster the size of a mountain floating in the clouds. It was too big. It broke all the rules of nature. It made her feel smaller than an insect. The sheer, impossible scale of the horror hanging above her filled her with a paralyzing, sickening dread. She wanted to run. She wanted to throw herself down the 142 steps, lock herself in the root cellar beneath the house, close her eyes and cover her ears until she woke up from this nightmare. But she could not look away. She pulled herself back up to the glass, her hands trembling so hard they rattled against the brass frame. Flash! The light hit the creature again. This time Helen noticed something new. The creature was shifting. The thick, hanging parts were slowly bending and pointing toward the lighthouse. The massive, writhing body was getting lower. The skin looked clearer now, closer. She could see deep ridges and scars on the pale flesh, and strange, dark openings that slowly opened and closed like breathing mouths. Flash! It was definitely lower. The beam of light didn't have to point as high to hit the belly of the beast. Helen realized with a jolt of pure terror what was happening. The creature was not just drifting in the storm. It was watching. It was reacting. The giant lens in the room with her was throwing out a bright, piercing light into the pitch-black night, and the monster was drawn to it. Like a common moth circling a porch lamp in the summer, this cosmic, impossible horror was being pulled toward the beacon. The light was calling it down. Helen backed away from the window, bumping into the brass railing that protected the great lens. The heat from the burning oil lamp warmed her back, but she was shivering uncontrollably. She looked at the bright yellow flames, at the clean wicks she had so carefully trimmed, at the shiny brass gears she had oiled, at the heavy weights she had cranked. She had made this light. She had made it as bright and strong as she possibly could. And now this light was pulling a monster down from the sky. If it kept coming down, it would crush the lighthouse. It would crush the island. The hanging tentacles alone were thick enough to wrap around the stone tower and snap it like a dry twig. The weight of the beast would push the entire rock into the sea. She would be destroyed, erased, swallowed by a nightmare that shouldn't exist. "Turn it off," she whispered to herself. Her voice sounded thin and raspy in the loud room. "Turn off the light." It was a simple action. All she had to do was reach over, turn the brass valve to cut off the flow of oil, and blow out the flames. The light would die. The glass lens would stop shining. The tower would go dark. The monster would lose its beacon. Maybe, without the light to draw it in, the massive creature would drift away into the storm, back up into the high clouds where it came from. She would be safe. She stepped toward the lamp. She reached her hand out toward the small brass valve. Her fingers brushed the warm metal, but then she stopped. She looked back out the window, down toward the angry, churning black ocean. Through the heavy rain and the sweeping beams of her own light, she saw something else. Far out in the distance, tossing wildly on the giant waves, was a tiny, faint light. It was a ship, a small vessel, fighting for its life in the hurricane. The tiny light dipped down behind a huge wave, disappearing from sight, and then popped back up a moment later, closer to the island. The ship was being pushed toward the coast by the savage wind. It was heading straight for the island, straight for the hidden sharp rocks that circled the base of the lighthouse like waiting teeth. Helen froze, her hand still hovering over the oil valve. The rules of her life, the deep duty that she and Arthur lived by, flooded back into her mind. The light must never go out. If the tower went dark, the sailors on that ship would not know where the rocks were. They would not be able to steer away. In the pitch black of the storm, they would be pushed right onto the deadly reef. The wooden hull of their ship would shatter. The freezing, violent water would pull them down, and every single person on that boat would drown in the dark. She stared at the tiny light of the struggling ship. Then she looked up. Flash. The giant beam swept across the sky, and the underside of the monster was illuminated again. It was closer now, much closer. The pale, wet skin filled her entire view of the sky. The dark, pulsing veins looked as thick as rivers. The hanging, reaching arms were descending, moving slowly but with terrifying purpose, grasping at the empty air above the tower. The creature made no sound that she could hear over the howling wind, which somehow made it even more horrifying. A silent mountain of living flesh sinking slowly toward her. Helen was trapped. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. She looked at the valve. She looked at the ship. She looked at the sky. If she turned the valve and extinguished the lamp, the tower would go dark. The monster in the sky would likely drift away, losing the bright flame it was seeking. Helen would live. The lighthouse would stand. But the ship below, carrying unknown souls, would crash against the rocks and sink into the freezing depths. Their blood would be on her hands. She would be a murderer, a keeper who abandoned her post when she was needed most. If she kept her hand away from the valve, if she let the fire burn and the heavy weights slowly turn the great glass lens, the bright beams would continue to sweep over the ocean. The sailors on the struggling ship would see the warning flashes. They would fight the wheel, turn their boat, and steer away from the deadly rocks to find safety in deeper waters. They would live. But the brilliant flashing light would continue to draw the attention of the colossal thing above. The monster would keep descending. It would reach the tower. It would crush the glass, the stone, and Helen herself under its incomprehensible mass. She stood frozen in the small space between the burning lamp and the cold glass window. The heat of the fire on her back, the freezing chill of the storm on her face. The ticking of the clockwork gears was perfectly steady, ignoring her terror. Click, click, click. The heavy weights slowly dropped down the centre of the stairs, doing exactly what she had wound them to do. Flash. The beam hit the creature. It was so close now, she felt she could almost reach out and touch the wet, grey skin. The smell of the ocean outside suddenly changed, mixing with a foul, heavy odour like rotting fish and ancient mud. The air in the lantern room grew thick and hard to breathe. The massive shadow blocked out the rain above the tower. The storm was still raging all around them, but directly above the lighthouse the rain stopped, blocked by the descending belly of the beast. Helen sobbed, a dry, painful sound in her throat. She looked down again. The ship was getting closer. It was fighting hard, but the wind was relentless. The sailors needed the light. They were depending on the keeper of the lighthouse to stay at her post. They trusted that the light would not fail them. She wrapped her arms around her own chest, hugging herself tightly to try to stop the violent shaking. She thought of Arthur. She wondered if he was on the mainland, safe and dry, looking out the window of an inn, hoping his brave wife was keeping the lamp burning. She wondered if he was thinking of her. She hoped he would not come back to find the tower broken and empty. Flash! The light swept over the creature again. One of the massive hanging appendages lowered itself, passing right by the glass of the lantern room. It was thick and rubbery, covered in strange flat suction cups that opened and closed. It blocked the light for a second, casting a deep, terrible shadow over Helen before the lens turned and pushed the beam past it. The creature was surrounding the top of the tower. It was hovering just feet away from the glass. Helen slowly lowered her hand away from the brass valve. She took a step back from the lamp, putting distance between herself and the mechanism that could plunge the world into darkness. She made her choice. She could not kill the men on the boat. She could not turn off the light. She was the lighthouse keeper's wife, and she would do her duty, even if the world had gone entirely mad. She walked over to the wooden stool she had dropped earlier and picked it up. She placed it right next to the brass railing, facing the window. She sat down. She kept her back straight and her hands folded tightly in her lap. The tears continued to run down her cold cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. She looked down at the ocean. The tiny light of the ship was still there. It seemed to be turning, fighting its way slowly parallel to the deadly rocks, guided by the sweeping flashes of the lighthouse beam. They had seen the warning. They were adjusting their course. A small, sad smile touched Helen's lips. The light was working. Then she looked up. The glass ceiling of the lantern room was completely dark. The massive creature had settled directly over the tower. The sweeping beam of the great lens now flashed directly into the wet, pale flesh that was pressing down upon the glass from the outside. The glass panes began to groan and creak under the immense pressure. The heavy brass frames whined, bending slowly inward. Helen did not look away. She sat perfectly still in the centre of the blinding light and the deafening noise. The heavy weights ticked, the gears turned, the fire burned bright. She watched the impossible nightmare descend upon her, knowing she had kept the light alive, knowing she had done her job to the very end. The glass above her began to crack, a loud, sharp sound that pierced through the noise of the storm, as the massive wet shadow finally closed over the light.